On behalf of the organising committee of the 10th World Conference on Qualitative Research, could I personally welcome you all along to this keynote address by Professor Alvesson from Lund University and Bath. I know we're going to give him a warm welcome despite the weather outside. I've just come from Dublin, Ireland, and it's similar, but I know we're going to give him a very warm welcome indeed. Professor Alvesson is currently based in Lund, and I know there's a relationship with Bath as well in Sweden, where he teaches at both doctoral and master's level. He's a particular focus on qualitative research methods and areas such as knowledge work, organizational change, and my particular favorite, functional stupidity, which he's an expert in, is one of his areas. And I know his teaching and his supervision certainly have made a significant contribution, and I aspire to this, to the development of critically engaged and reflective scholars, something I know at this morning's session, workshop, I think it was extraordinarily useful to see scholars there reflecting on their own work and sharing those experiences, which I thought was hugely valuable. His work is internationally recognized, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of his writings and his publications. I have pages here to list them, but we'd be here for an hour if I was to go through them all. In fact, some of his textbooks are identified there, and I think I have to pass through the audience later on and let you sample them and leaf through them. More broadly, his research interests include things like critical theory, gender, power, leadership. We had really good discussions this morning around leadership and identity and organizational culture. Today's address is titled Doing Reflexive and Imaginative Research, and I absolutely know he's going to challenge us, he's going to provoke us, he may even upset one or two in the audience with his extraordinary ideas, and it strikes me when I looked at one of the books there, The Art of Less, a testament to this man's brilliance and his capacity to stitch together quite diverse ideas. Is one of the pages, the early pages, has quotations from both Franz Kafka and Bruce Lee. So I had to think a little bit about how those things join together, but it's an extraordinary testament to the man himself. I know he's going to argue, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, that some research, while it may be technically correct, it certainly runs the risk of becoming trivialized because it's been dominated by often quite narrow theoretical framings and sometimes excessive data accumulation. And I certainly know that he's going to bring us on this insightful and imaginative journey where we're going to move towards what he describes as gold nuggets. Again, that's a particular fascination for me. And this notion around serendipity, and it is agentic. We have capacity to be serendipitous in how we do it. And I think his ideas around disciplined imagination, and I love the way he puts those ideas together, are for us certainly very much the theme. So again, could I ask that we give Professor Alvesson a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Then hopefully you can understand me as well. So before we start, I take a picture of you. You look very nice. It's perhaps at some distance, but if you take a picture of people, they always smile, and then they become a bit more happy. Thanks so much for inviting me here. Very honored, very pleased, and to talk a bit about one of my favorite topics, how to do interesting research, really. So, and I've written a lot of books about this topic, and within the field of qualitative research, there are different strands, and one is that we should become rigorous and scientific and reliable and maximize rationality, procedures, data management, really show that we got it right and are very credible as researchers. I'm not so interested in that. I think that in social science, then the world is always changing, and there's an enormous amount of variation, so the specific empirics are not necessarily that interesting. What's more interesting is to generate ideas, theories, and sometimes also to produce empirical descriptions that have some depth and richness so that people remember them and start to think a bit differently. How many of you are familiar with Geertz, thick description? Some working a lot with thick description at the moment, and here the idea is that you do in-depth empirical research, but mainly use it also as a trampoline, as an elevator to generate empirically grounded, interesting, relevant ideas. So the problem with a lot of social research is that we are not seen necessarily as that interesting. Some of you, when you write the paper, a lot of people are very interested in reading the paper. I think that's not so common. In many cases, yeah, that's an interesting paper, people say, but they don't necessarily mean that. And often we read stuff that is a bit formulaic, a bit boring, a bit unimaginative. So, and with massification of higher education, we have massification of universities and of research. And in this area, then, much is about being instrumental, getting a job, getting some recognition, being employable, being promotable, and being metricsable. So that deans and others can count publications and then say that we are a good faculty, good school, good university. And sometimes the joke says, deans are people that can't read but count. So a lot of research is counting publications rather than saying something original and interesting. And a lot of research has little to say that is really novel or interest outside a small sub-tribe of fellow academics. Studies are often reasonably correct, but often a bit trivial. Sometimes you have the problem of producing pretentious common sense. Pretentious common sense. So, relatively trivial study, interviewed 40 people, they told me so and so on, I can summarize the results and the findings, they experience or talk about reality, so and so. And then I need to coach it in a particular language, so it appears very scientific. And then we have a lot of abstractions and so on, but it becomes easily a bit of pretentious common sense. And according to one study of all academic disciplines, published in Nature or in Science 2023, then there are very few disruptive studies that really make a difference. Most are studies then more or less the same as what others are doing. Of course, when it comes to the empirical details or the gap in the literature that you try to fill, it may be novel, but it's not necessarily so that it makes much of a difference. And I think that we could do a bit better. Not all of us all the time, but if we work more ambitiously with reflexivity and creativity, we can increase imagination and be more likely to come up with new contributions. So reflexivity is like a buzzword. It's one citation, the assessment of the relationship between the knowledge that we produce and how we do this knowledge. And in many cases, it's not the world out there that we manage to say so much precise or novel or interesting about, but we tend to follow norms, conventions, vocabularies, paradigms, institutionalized arrangements that govern a lot of what we are doing. So if we think about a research article, why do they have to look as they do? Well, it's because this is absolutely the best way of expressing knowledge. Well, it may also be a matter of conventions. And over the years, the articles become longer and longer, more and more formulaic, more and more method sections, etc., etc. So this governs what we do, and this is quite problematic. So reflexivity, there's a lot of different views on reflexivity. Often people associate this with narcissism. It's about me, who I am, how I did the study and what happened during the process and so on. So that's quite common. I think that me-ism or narcissism is a less interesting aspect around reflexivity. Of course, we need to consider this when we do research. It's not done by, hopefully not by AI yet, at least, but people are involved. And who is doing the study definitely strongly influences the outcomes. But perhaps more interesting than exactly who is doing the study and the experiences and emotions and personal inclinations, etc., may be what perspectives are we using and how are perspectives controlling us when we do the research. So you are Foucauldian, perhaps, and then Foucault talks through you, and then the result is very much as if Foucault or Foucauldian language is masterminding the study rather than you are that creative or innovative yourself. So reflexivity for me is very much a matter of trying to consider different perspectives, challenge perspectives, and then you challenge yourself, and then through not being caught in one perspective, but being open-minded about all this, you may be able to say something that is a bit more novel. I and Sköldberg, we had a definition of reflexivity where we try to consider the various aspects, linguistic, the vocabularies that we are using, the social context, including norms, etc., the political context. How do you navigate in order to get published, for example? There's a lot of political and power maneuvering role all this. You navigate the social political landscape, and then you may become successful as a researcher, and then you try to mobilize support and citations and so on. So it's a politically sensitive situation. And of course, all the social norms. How do you refer to issues? What are hot topics? What are conventions? What are fashions? There are a lot of social determinants behind what we are doing, and fine, unavoidable, but we need to be quite careful and reflexive and critical about all this. And if we are, then we can break away a bit from all the constraining, mainstreaming, conformist, producing elements that tend to make research often not so imaginative, not so interesting, not so influential. So we define, and here Rorty says that we should consider irony and write in a more ironic way when we do research, meaning that we are all the time aware there is an alternative and perhaps better, another way of doing this research. So it's not that this is the superior way of understanding something. We are aware that there may be other and more interesting, better ways. And if you have that as an orientation or attitude, then it's more easy then perhaps than to come up with something that is a bit novel. So normally when people think about what science, including social science, it's very much something that we do here because it's defined by the scientific method. So you follow methodological rules. And if you do that, then you are really scientific, you are rational, you come up with something that is much better grounded, that is superior to other types of knowledge. And here you emphasize values, ideals such as rationality, you follow procedures, you use techniques, you aim for objectivity, neutrality, you try to be as transparent as possible, you separate theory and data. So these are some of the common dominating norms. And this is also very much the case for most of qualitative research, including Strauss and Corbin. They say that the matching of theory against data must be rigorously carried out. Sounds good. What's the problem with this? Well, you can counter that with an alternative view, an alternative view that says that the matching of theory against data can't be rigorously carried out. partly because all data tend to be theory impregnated. If you go out there and you count heads, then you need to have an idea what is a head. Perhaps not a sophisticated theory, but in most cases you can't observe anything, you can't produce data if you don't have some kind of theory about the phenomena. So if you're interested in family, I mean, what is a family? Can be defined in very different ways, cultural variations and so on. Or you're interested in leadership. I mean, what is leadership? It is very seldom you can say, this is leadership. Donald Trump standing there and saying something extremely stupid, according to most of us. No, that's leadership. I mean, is it or not? So you need to have a theory, what is leadership? So all data, they tend to be theory impregnated. And that's the problem with a lot of this kind of vigorous stuff in qualitative research. And I see reflexivity as an alternative. You cherish other values. You highlight other types of ideas when you do research. So disciplined imagination. You think about different ways of seeing phenomena. And really try to consider this carefully. Can I expand the various perspectives of my imagination in order to see this in different lights? So what goes on here? Who is the person in front of me? So there are a lot of issues like that where you can be much more imaginative. But of course you can't just be free-floating. So you need to consider existing knowledge, existing perspectives, ideas, what may be wrong with all this. So it's not a license for just saying anything. But discipline and animation, the careful consideration of how paradigms, pre-understandings, languages, theory data are being impregnating each other of views, and conventions, how it works. Reflexivity means that how do we do research? You carefully think through this and then see if you can challenge some of the conventions and come up with alternative and better ways perhaps, or at least more creative ways of considering something. And normally you have the idea that we deliver results. These are the findings. Look at executive summary and you see what are the conclusion outcome of the study. If you're more into reflexivity, you may be much more interested in the crafting of an insightful text. So that all things that you address in your text should be carefully thought through. And you try to open up for alternative meanings, alternative aspects. So it's a more creative enterprise. Rather than you have a research question, you do a study, you deliver results, and you tell people how the world is functioning, how it is in your particular sub-area. The creative, the insightful text, you start to read it, and then you think, here I can think differently or in a more reflexive way about certain things. So the insightful text, I tend to try to do that myself. Sometimes my co-authors, they complain that I write like a cauliflower. Start here and then some ideas and some reflections. I think it's interesting and I think it's creative, but they sometimes can be a bit irritated by the lack of clear linearity, and it also calls for some extra space. So they can be a bit irritated, but one should not overdo it, that according to my co-authors, but on the whole, it works quite nicely. So challenging a preferred vocabulary and a line of thinking through issues, using alternative points of departure. So if we study, for example, a manager. What is a manager? Well, a manager is the top figure that is then managing subordinates, and how is the managing going on? That's one option, but we can also see the manager as servant, as a janitor at the workplace, as a plumber. That's the latest idea we are working with. Managers not as leaders, but hopefully as administrative plumbers, trying to get workflow going and removing a lot of the sludge that otherwise are piling up in organizations. So, or you can see managers as meeting workers. I mean, what do managers do? They sit in meetings. So rather than studying them as managers, managing subordinates, or as leaders, leading the troops, you study them as meeting workers. And then with reflexivity, you consider a number of different alternatives, you produce alternatives, you consider them, and then you make a choice, because you can't study all aspects in all ways, but you can have with you the mindset that there are different ways of understanding this, and you are careful about picking ideas and making interpretations that are well-founded, but also interesting, because you are not just following the kind of flow or the convention or the vocabularies that are dominant. So for me, this is reflexivity. And I work with that all the time, and I think that it's a very clear payoff. And one aspect around here, you get more ideas, and you get also much broader readership, according to my experience at least. One element here is that we need to be rather suspicious about dominant ways of representing and understanding phenomena. So a lot of things that we go out there, we study then organizations, like in my case, a workplace. There are strategies, there are middle managers, there is quality improvement, there is HR, there are a lot of other things. People do leadership, there are teams, team building, etc. So there are a lot of stuff like this, enormous HR or branding apparatuses, etc. So, and we tend to take this for granted. It's natural, they are there. We go out and then observe this phenomena. But as Foucault then would say that it's very important then to investigate what's the kind of basis, the ground, historical background before a particular phenomena is being established as something that you can study. So take diversity management, take gender equality, leadership, followership, teams, quality systems, HR in various forms. I mean, where are these things coming from? They're not just a natural thing for us to study. We need to really carefully consider the background, the development, and how we get caught in understanding the world in these ways. And then we have these understandings and views, we take them for granted, we go out there, we study phenomena, and then a lot of things are, as Dire Straits would put it, the dice was, Dire Straits, not Dire Straits would put it, the dice was loaded from the start. With this input, well, is the point in doing an empirical study? Well, you discover certain details, and you can add marginally to existing knowledge, but most things there are given, because we just accept paradigms, frameworks, conventions, and then we do non-imaginative studies, which is very common. Of course, you are certainly, we in this room, we are different from the other boring people out there. When we read journal articles and we listen to presentations, often it's not that bloody interesting. Foucault says that the problem with the knowledge that we create is not whether it's distorts or reveals the truth. It may be good, truthful study, finding it may correct, or it may not be correct. That's not so important, according to Foucault. The problem with knowledge is that it creates the truth. So we assume that there are leaders doing leadership, there are strategies, and they are important for results. Of course, we create the truth. So we create people, managers being kind of leaders or leader wannabes. And people then respond to this as followers, relatively passive and dependent on the leadership stuff, for example. You see the point? And we need to be very careful about the truths that we produce through our knowledge. And in that sense, organizations like universities, they are full of knowledge that people in management and social science have produced, about a lot of issues, and that's the reason why we are suffering sometimes, because there's quality systems, there is HR, there is leadership emphasis on senior people doing strategies that the rest of us are supposed to follow as troops. This is how knowledge creates the truth. And sometimes I work at the business school, I feel, okay, it deserves us right. Now we get the knowledge back through organizational bureaucracy and other arrangements. So the point here is that we need to be a bit cautious and careful about the knowledge that we're interested in doing. So my interest is very much in then producing methodologies for insight generation. I think we are not into the truth-finding business. We should not also either be in the I do an interesting empirical study and report what people have told me in interviews, or relatively simple and straightforward observations. That's fine, but insight generation, then we need to say something that makes a qualified reader read the text and say, now I come out and feel that I'm a bit more clever than before. I think about issues. I got some insights. I got some provocations, some ideas, some new vocabularies that add something to how I think about issues. So this is, for me, then the key element of doing research, and then reflexivity, where the world should be seen as a bit more exotic, a bit more strange, a bit more peculiar, perhaps even a bit more bizarre than we normally think about it. I normally then think that we live in a bizarre world. I mean, why do people need to have more money in a world where overconsumption is an enormous problem? Food is thrown away, 1/3. Clothes are not used. People have too many things, etc. And still economic growth and more resources and more consumption and so on. I mean, for some people this is relevant to consider this, but in rich countries in the West, it's quite absurd that we are so upset or obsessed with this. Perhaps, I'm just saying this is an example how we can, or if we take leadership, do we really need that much leadership? Couldn't we be independent people using our own judgment, getting support from colleagues and self-organize and do much more without this enormous amount of support from leadership? It can also be seen as rather bizarre and strange. But in order to see this and open up for alternative viewpoints, we really need then to be quite reflexive about a lot of things that we tend to take for granted. We could work with alternative metaphors. I mentioned them when you study managers. Yeah, you can study managers as big leaders, or as servants, as plumbers, administrative plumbers, or something else, bureaucrats, etc. So, and then you can switch metaphors depending on what seems to be empirically relevant and helpful, but also what could generate new ideas and then challenge then dominant thinking. And most people think, that's very difficult and very demanding and so on. My experience is when you really have a novel idea that is reasonably well supported, then there's a lot of interest for this, and it's not more difficult to publish that than conventional, non-imaginative, mainstream stuff. So often, actually, when I approach an editor and says, we have this idea, and they can be very enthusiastic. And sometimes they even can say, we'll try to find reviewers that really are on board. So it's not that it's extremely difficult, but it calls for some extra effort, I think. Thick description, we mentioned research as beach combing. Are you familiar with that idea? The idea is that normally I need to have a large sample. I go out there, I interview 40, 50 people. I do this very diligently, and then I treat all the material in a fair way. Everything is really carefully considered. I do coding of it and really do careful data analysis of it all. That's one approach. Another approach is that you see empirical work is beach combing. Beach combing, it means that you walk around on the beach and then you see if you spot something interesting. Often you spot a lot of garbage or useless stuff, a lot of sand or rocks perhaps. You can't use that as much, but sometimes you see something interesting. A shell could be used as part of your artistic interests, or some pieces of polished wood that the children perhaps could play with. So you see certain things that are interesting, work with your creative mindset, and then you focus on that, and all the other stuff you let be. So if you do interviews, you can say that most people they tell you what you've heard many times before. But sometimes there is something that is really interesting, a person that is insightful, have an interesting story, perhaps typical or not so typical, but there's something here that works creatively for you. And the idea is to find these elements and work much more intensively with this. It should not be cherry picking, so you can't make empirical claims based on something that is perhaps a bit odd and strange. But if you can see the theoretical, the interpretive value of this, so it can lead to a new idea, a new insight, a new conceptualization, the start of a new theory perhaps. Then you go for that and then you skip or treat relatively modestly all the other material that you may have encountered. So that's beach combing as a kind of tactic. Skip something here. So I will briefly talk about 4 specific methods that one can use, and I'm using that all the time. It's assumption challenging, it's the creation and solving of mysteries in research, it's the construction of phenomena, and it's serendipity spotting. So some of you, how many of you here participated in the workshop this morning on serendipity? It's about 1/3, so I will just briefly mention this here, but mainly talk about the other 3 approaches. So assumption challenging, the creation and solving of mysteries in research, phenomena construction, and serendipity spotting or serendipity chasing as approach. And I think that this has some potential then to work a bit differently. So challenging assumptions. How many of you are familiar with Murray Davies' article in Philosophy and Social Science, 1971? The title is That's Interesting. And Davies, he looked at a large number of highly influential social and behavioral theories, and he asked, okay, what's the common denominator? How come that these have been so influential? Is it because they are true? No. He starts his article by saying, most people believe that the theory is influential because most people believe that the theory is influential because it's true. People are wrong. A theory is influential because it's interesting. People see this as interesting. Often, very influential theorists, they can't so easily be tested. Freud, psychoanalysis, Foucauldian ideas, a lot of other really interesting stuff. It can't really be tested, so it can be seen as credible and okay and so on. But empirical backup is not strongly relevant for the influence of a particular theory in social science. And he explains this by people encounter something that they find interesting because it's challenging, it's different than what they expected, and then they remember it, and they start to think about it, and then they communicate it to others, and it makes a difference for how people think about phenomena compared to something that is probably true, but it's not particularly different or stand out, or it's not challenging or add through expanding your mindset in relationship to what you have thought about before. So that's interesting. It's a fantastic good article. Murray Davis in Philosophy of the Social Sciences, 1971. And most people that have read it, I find that it is really interesting and it's really valuable. He even offers an index of the interesting, some clear guidelines for how to do research in such a way so it leads to interesting results. And of course, interesting, it's partly a personal, individualistic, subjective matter, but often people do agree. Not everybody, but a lot of people agree this is interesting. So he says then the trick is then, if you want to be seen as interesting and also to become influential, then you must first be familiar with what the audience assumes to be true about a subject. And then you generate a proposition which, in denying this assumption, will attract attention. So this is like the general kind of rule. And this is something that we can take seriously. One of the followers of Davis, Graham Astley, he wrote that there are two kinds of researchers. There are people that are normal and normalized, conventional people. They accept worldviews and ideas in the collective. And then you have what he says, calls intuitively perverse researchers. They're always ready to deviate, to reject notions seen as truthful and self-evident by others. And then you can now think about yourself. What kind of researchers are you? Are you conventional researchers or are you perverse researchers? It's a difficult existential question, of course, for a lot of people. Foucault himself then, who is very much into the problematization, assumption challenging, doing interesting research, he himself had some peculiar orientations, as some of you may know. We shouldn't go into that, as that may be a bit sensitive for some souls. So we developed this idea, and then we thought this is the way to do research in terms of generating research questions and research ideas. And then you follow a few simple steps. You target the domain. I'm interested in that and that area. Then you read stuff and you identify and articulate assumptions. So these are the taken for granted assumptions in this area. And then you evaluate these assumptions, and then you carefully consider, are these assumptions reasonable? Are there some problems with these assumptions? Why are they taken for granted? And then, based on that, you start to think, can I develop alternative assumptions? Which you can with some creativity and some intellectual efforts. So you develop some alternative assumptions. And then you consider the assumptions in relationship to the audience. So according to this line of thinking, it's very phenomenological in the sense that we can't measure assumptions against reality out there, but we can measure them against people's perceptions, evaluations, experiences. And the idea here is not to maximize truthful findings. The idea is to maximize research that is seen as interesting and becoming influential because people see this is adding to their mindsets. So it's mind stretching. It's reconsidering what we do, etc. So you consider assumptions in the relationship to the audience, and then you work with a particular assessment ground where there are three types of verdicts. And you can check this when you read something. One is that this is obvious when you have a research finding, result, an idea. This is obvious. This is boring. That's one assessment. And then, on the other hand, if you do, that's because there are no credible assumption challenging. Assumptions are just being reproduced. So we knew that before, nothing really new here. This is rather boring, it's obvious. Fine, you're on. And then you may be able then to challenge some assumptions in a qualified, interesting, credible way, and then the response will be, that's interesting. I pay attention, I think this is worth thinking further about, etc. If you do some credible assumption, challenging, but then there is a third option then, if you do a lot of assumption challenging, very heavy assumption challenging, will it not be even more interesting and fascinating, and people will then, yes. Well, no, they are more inclined to become irritated and upset and frustrated because they can't accept too much of assumption challenging, because then there's a mental breakdown and it's not seen as so credible, and you can't really use it for something. So you should not overdo this either, at least not for an audience that is a bit stuck in certain frameworks and so on, and most are. So challenging assumption is another variable here. And then we have challenging assumption from zero challenging assumption to very strong challenging of many assumptions. And then the response tends to go like this. So there's an optimum. And this is what you can do in order to become, to kind of hit that optimality.
Oh, really?
Or producing an interesting research contribution. But that calls for training towards then identifying, articulating, and challenging assumptions. So this is something you can do. You look at the literature, identify, articulate, and challenge. I often have the example then of values. Talked about that during lunch and so on. But one assumption is people have do you have values? No. Well, all people have values, of course. And then that's one assumption. People have values. Are you in favor of the environment? Are you against animal cruelty? Yes, perhaps. Do you eat meat? Do you fly a lot? Do you spend a lot of your money on consumption, etc.? Yeah. So the values tend to be a bit like this. You like independence, autonomy, use your own judgment, being kind of free. Yes. A lot of people say, is it important with good leadership? Yes. And the good leadership is supportive and give direction and is servant and blah, blah, blah. And then people can move a bit between. So I'm not saying that people don't have values or that leadership is not important, but often when you investigate this, one assumption people tend to have values, another assumption that people tend to be a bit more wishy-washy or move around or being value jumpers. Or people may have politically correct values or identity supporting, self-esteem supporting values, but in a lot of situations then these values may be a bit more loosely held. So the idea is here that you can open up certain assumptions and you work with counter assumptions, and then you can do research based on the latter. Truth, if there is a truth, may be something in between, but studies based on the alternative idea that people may do value jumping. that could lead to an interesting study compared to the study 20,000 where people measure values or qualitatively measure values. So the study from another angle could be seen as perhaps adding something significant and interesting to what we already know. And then it's up to people themselves to consider this in different ways, but still. Or people do gender, that's one assumption about how we function. One can also have the counter-assumption that a lot of the time in contemporary society we do not do gender at work. We do other things instead. We may do age, we may do professionalism, we may do our idiosyncratic orientations or other things. And then you can study then the doing of gender, but you can also study the non-doing or the neutralization of gender based on the assumption that perhaps people are not that fixated on gender as we historically have led to believe, and at a time when gender was much more significant perhaps in certain types of workplace contexts. So there are different assumptions, and the idea here that you start doing research in different ways based on different research ideas and questions. And sometimes with a new question there comes a new answer. Shouldn't go into this. Second approach here is mystery creation. And then so assumption challenging is that more you look at the field, you look at the literature, you look at the ideas that are there, and then you try to see what alternative ideas could be produced based on questioning assumptions. If you do empirical work, then you can try then to work with mystery creation. So interesting research, it's based on two ideas. You try to create a mystery. So you look around there, most things appear to be reasonable and rational and as expected. And you have explanations for absolutely everything. But sometimes you can create a mystery when you're out there. And why are people doing this? What is this all about? What are the contradictions, the unexpected stuff taking place here? So you create a mystery out of something that is seen as rather self-evident, or you really encounter something that everybody agrees upon. This is a mystery. That's one example. And people study longer and longer time, IQ level tend to go down. If you know about the Flynn effect. In the 20th century, people become a bit better in terms of using their intellectual, cognitive resources. The last 20 years, it seems to be the opposite effect. At the same time as so many people are studying for so long time. There's also a lot of science on mental health issues amongst young people in many countries. At the same time, everything should be much better. Better parenthood, upbringing, more social support, better work and life conditions and so on, and mental health seems to going downhill. I mean, these are examples of mysteries. And there are a lot of mysteries also on the small scale. Why are they doing this if you look more carefully? Why are people spending so much time in meetings, being so frustrating for a lot of people? So you find a mystery, and then the audience will say, this is a mystery. I have not thought really about this. And then you try to solve the mystery through empirical work, tracing the clues and so on. So research text is more like a detective story. So you hook people on the presentation of a mystery, and then you guide them through the mystery with some novel ideas, an explanation, new vocabulary that seems to be a bit of a solution, or at least illumination of the problem. Well, this is just an illustration of all this. And here you see the empirical material. Often we see the empirical material, also known as data, as signposts that shows the way to the truth. Data show me the truth. Data are my shepherd. They will show me the truth. Well, I mean, data can be quite misleading, quite problematic, and lie. Data is always unreliable, but sometimes they can function as a dialogue partner. They encourage you to think a bit differently about issues, perhaps. And then they can help you to unsettle thinking, encourage rethinking, and be helpful in producing a mystery, perhaps. So there's some questions here. So how am I doing with time? 5 minutes, then I'm really quick here. The third option is phenomena construction. So most of the time we believe that there are phenomena out there, and then we go out and we study these phenomena. They are fixed, they are ready, they are available, they are for grabs. That's one approach. Another approach is that, well, we should not be stuck in established phenomena. We should be much more engaged in producing phenomena, coming up with structuring, conceptualizing, generally constructing the world in slightly unexpected ways. So we do research not in order to investigate a phenomenon, but to discover or reconstruct it. So, and that means that we don't accept a lot of the established constructions, but we ask what's the meaning of all this, and can we kind of reconstruct them in different ways. So phenomena, they shouldn't be seen as given or established, but how can we generate and establish new phenomena in research? And we do this through discovering novel patterns in data. We approach data from different perspectives. We try to undo a lot of the phenomena constructions that are there already. And we do this partly through intellectual work, but also with empirical inspiration. So just some examples. Graeber, how many are familiar with Graeber's book on bullshit jobs? Some are. That a lot of jobs, they are quite meaningless. People don't do anything. They are seen by people supposed to perform them as really bullshit jobs, and it's very frustrating. So his phenomena there is bullshit jobs. That's a phenomenon that he then constructed, of course with reality background, but it didn't present it itself. So it called for some empirical inspiration from people doing certain claims, and then he kind of gathers this and thinks it through, and then he constructs the phenomenon of bullshit jobs. Sennett, familiar with Sennett, the corrosion of character. That's another phenomenon, that character used to be kind of built and developed, expanded, etc. But then character is now being corroded. So kind of ethical commitments and the sense of life and person hanging together, that is being kind of lost through quarterly capitalism and fragmentations of life and so on. So not so many routines that allow you to build character, but character tends to be fragmented and corroded. So character corrosion, that's another example of a phenomena. I don't have it here, but Furedi, he talks about the culture of fear. The culture of fear, where risk obsession dominates contemporary society. People are afraid of so many things, and risks and risk minimization is very much on the agenda in many situations. So it identifies the phenomenon of culture of fear. In all my research, we tend to come up with some phenomena, identity work, identity regulation, at least in management and organization studies, they're a bit novel. We thought about managers, and one concept that popped up was the idea of managers as yo-yos. They go down and they go up. They look up sometimes and they look down sometimes. It's not like the middle manager, or most managers, they are there in the middle. They rarely are. Most of the time they are in a yo-yo position. So then you think about the phenomena. It's not a stable position, but all the time then moving in different ways through corporate hierarchies. Then it's a very different type of phenomena than a stable middle manager position. So I shouldn't bore you with all this, but we had a piece now recently published, Strategy as Parody. Corporate strategy as parody. Nobody takes it really seriously, so it's more like a joke, and it's different from strategy as planning or strategy as process. So in the study then we thought this is a different kind of phenomenon, and then you launch this as the contribution. We have discovered a new phenomenon, strategy as parody, where people do strategy work, but nobody is taking it really seriously. And then we label this as strategies as parody. So working with serendipity, well, I covered this morning, but it means that you try to be much more open for unexpected, by chance, appearing observations that give you a trigger to think differently. And it can be outside your small focus study, but when serendipity, by happy chance, something pops up, something that triggers you to think differently, then you go for it. And a lot of serendipities in life happen in front of us, but we tend to miss it because we tend to be not so imaginative, very focused, very much in trying to deliver bad results. So in order to work with serendipity, you need to cultivate openness, and this is very difficult to cultivate openness. Most of the time we like to be a bit more closed. We try to counteract all the negative forces that hinder serendipity. It makes this really a non-issue. I mean, the STEM areas, there are a lot of serendipity because it's a bit easier then. This is easier to observe and do something with sometimes. And a lot of the great innovations, they've been out, penicillin, antibiotics, for example. That's serendipity, observation by chance, that put the researchers on the right track. Industry is also common when it comes to innovations. So, but we need to expand our understanding and preparedness, and we need to engage in serendipity search, not just waiting for this to happen, but also to be actively observing what's happening and talk to people about unexpected experiences or something else, and then you can be much more into this. So I will round off now, and then shortage of new ideas. Research is often quite boring, predictable, and journals are complaining, very few new ideas, etc. Box thinking is often preferred. This is socially, cognitively, and existentially much safer. It's easier, it's much safer, so we go to the box and are protected by being in a particular box. We could perhaps be a bit more creative and imaginative, and sometimes I wonder, why in hell are taxpayers paying us? Do they really get something for this enormous amount of papers and publications that are being kind of produced? Very little in many cases. So we can be a bit more creative and imaginative, partly through theoretical work, but also through empirical studies that tends to be a bit more open for this kind of stuff. So these are 4 proposals, and there are papers and books supporting all this in case you are interested. And we said that we have about 10 minutes for 5, 10. Yeah, a few minutes for this, and then we take a break, and then if some people are interested in having smaller group discussions, we can continue a bit after that, but you may feel saturation. But under the skillful management of our chairperson here, we now have some time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I should say Professor Alvesson has very generously offered, I know we're pushed a little bit for time, but I still think we should have some, with your permission, we should have some questions from the floor. But Professor Alvesson has said after this session, he's very happy to stay on and to engage with people on a longer basis. as long as the room isn't booked out. I have a suggestion for your new title of your new book, Write Like a Cauliflower.
Okay, yes, yes, I will suggest that to my suffering co-authors. So
we might take one or two comments. As I said, one or two comments from the floor, questions from the floor, and then I'll allow Professor Alvesson to arrange a slightly offside meeting. So, anybody, any thoughts from the front, sir?
Thanks. I hope I can project my voice. Thank you very much for.
There's a microphone here. Yeah, there's a microphone coming in.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Thank you. After your contribution, thank you very much. I'm not going to have tea. I'm not going to talk to anybody. I'm going to go home and reflect. You got me very excited because you're speaking into something that I've actually been having a conversation with ChatGPT on. That research culture is very constrictive, very tunnel visioned, and it's reactive. Defining research on the basis of existing problems is very limiting because it's not innovative at all. I think the best intelligence is beyond reactionary or reactive positioning. It's imaginative. It must see things even when they're not there. It doesn't have to respond to what it sees. It has to think what is unseen and then negotiate it, as you say, find a phenomenon, even if it doesn't see it with the eye. So what you're saying is very, very creative, very, very threatening to traditional research approach, but I think it's necessary. And I wanted to just thank you for that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
thank you.
There's certainly that sense of provocation with progress, my sense of what was happening.
Maybe now? Oh, there we go.
Yep.
First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It was absolutely fascinating. You were talking about writing like a cauliflower in terms of finding myriad new ideas and expanding into them. One of the criticisms often levelled against that style of writing, sort of tied back to the CCRU, if you're familiar with them back in Warwick, sort of the Nick Land and Mark Fisher-esque, when they started going down the line of sort of cybernetic culture, etc. When you are writing, and in that cauliflower fashion, how do you make sure that you are sort of self-containing in a way to make sure that the positions you're reaching are still explicitly demonstrable logically to the people that are reading them?
Well, I think that people should be on board, so it should be not too idiosyncratic, but you really need to think about an audience all the time. And then the audiences, they are a bit different. So I assume that my audience should be interested in ideas and think about issues and should not just be too kind of square or silo thinking in the approach. So I try to consider that, and I find it easier to write books perhaps, because then you are allowed then to have associations, to make some discretions, to point at interesting aspects without being too much focused. But then there still should be a clear idea or some direction, and you can't address everything in the same text. So it is a bit of a dilemma between being extremely seen as rigorous and rational and narrow-minded, and then started to think about all the concepts and ideas, the truths and the references that we are using. Of course, they are much more problematic than they appear. And just take a literature review. You're supposed to, 3 pages, then summarize 150 studies. And it's mission impossible. How do you do it here? So it needs to be a compromise between them, okay, summarizing some of the stuff, showing that you have read it, or at least you can refer to it, and then perhaps inserting some intelligent comments and problematizations around all this. But it is a dilemma. And sometimes you tend to be too much of that, and sometimes you tend to do a bit too much of this. But it's a judgment call, and I think we need to think about this all the time. It's easier than if you're very much into particular sub-area. You only read stuff within that, and you fully accept then the truths, the conventions, the vocabularies, and you see them as given. Then it's easier to work like this. But if you start to think, then, oh, this is much more problematic, and I think that some amount of problematization and reminding yourself, but also the audience, that there are other ways of seeing this, and we shouldn't take a lot of the conventional stuff too seriously.
Thank you very much. We just take the lady next to my friend there who's just asked that question, and then what we might do is we'll break off into we'll formally end the session. Thank Professor Alvesson, and then we'll break off into.
So.
Hello. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I also kind of going off of the previous question, the way that you described research to me really seemed like a piece of good art. So one of the things that I felt was that, and please correct me if I'm wrong by the way, is that cultivating balance is important. But then the question I have is as follows. What kind of tips would you be willing to give to make, to let's say, a novice researcher so that they maintain a sort of balance and they don't go in the direction of being, interesting for the sake of interesting versus, actually doing something that is meaningful and not, excuse the word, masturbatory in essence?
I think that's a problem. That intellectual masturbation may be the tricky thing in different ways. Sometimes you do this for just fine-tuning and optimizing a very narrow mindset. So how do I measure this exactly or whatever? So that may be the problem also for vigorous people sometimes. But I think we need to consider the audience. So being very careful about, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this because taxpayers, there are bus drivers, there are cleaners, there are a lot of people. They spend money then paying universities and university people. So we should take some responsibility of what we are doing. And sometimes it leads to people being very then responsive to power. So elites and so on, we follow what they want us to do, politicians and corporate leaders. They want us to deliver results on that and that and that, and for me that's could be considered, but take some broader intellectual responsibility, realize that we belong to a privileged group, more or less of course, but still consider an audience, and the audience should not just be your fellow egocentric academic sub-tribe, but hopefully some practitioners or some members of the public that may be interested in the stuff. And if you have that with you all the time, then the risk of intellectual masturbation is much lower. But it's so easy that because people are not interested in what we're doing normally, and then it's a license then to just do what you are interested in and what you support, what's supportive of your career. But we need to think about the audience out there, and hopefully not everybody and not in a populistic way, but still having something to say to intelligence, thoughtful people interested in whatever we manage to study.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
I have one more small duty to perform.
Oh.
On behalf of the organising committee, we just really like to sincerely thank Professor Alvesson for delivering the keynote. Thank you,
Oh,
sir.
thank you very much.
Very
thank you.
thought-provoking indeed.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
I think, and you're going to stay for.
I stay here. If there's like, we can talk individually, but if there is some people interested in discussing, we could form a small group here for 10-15 minutes also, if you're interested in that.
Well, I would, yes.
But otherwise, the formal session is over. You have other duties. If you want to stay to talk, then it's fine. So, but we have 1 minute break and then see if there is an audience here. So.